Yeah, thanks again, Annalisa, and also Renaud for organizing all this, inviting me to speak here. And my title is The Missing Link, What Psy Tells Us About Biology and Evolution. And yeah, Annalisa said already a few words about myself. I'd like to add that I work at the Institute for Frontier Areas of Psychology and Mental Health, and I greet you from Freiburg in Germany, and the sun is just setting here, so it's now going to be dark soon. Anyway, I will be talking about topics I introduced to a German readership some years ago in this book called Evolution and Parapsychology as Foundations for a New Biology and the Revitalization of Vitalism. And in this book, I was concerned with questions such as what is life? What are some riddles of evolution? And now in this talk, I will also add a few historical words on that, providing a perspective on other authors, what they thought about these matters. And in the last part of my talk, I will also have a look into the present and into the future, so what we can do with regard to these topics. All right. So, well, I am a biologist, so biologists are, or they should be, concerned with the question, what is life? And if you want to know about this, you have to know what an organism is. And I think if you want to know what an organism is, you should also know what evolution is, because organisms are what evolution made of them. So if we enter all this and we have a look at the great variety of life, such as in this example of the southern American rainforest, you see that there's a huge variety of plants and animals and forms and shapes and colors and habitats and behavioral strategies to survive. And of course, biologists have long been concerned with all these questions, explaining how is all this possible. And if you go to your school and universities, you have, of course, a theory to all that, which is typically put forward in the framework of a physicalist framework. So the physicalist hypothesis of modern biology regarding life and evolution is based on the neo-Darwinian perspective. And I'll just outline this for you in case you don't know it yet. The origin of life, basically, this is due to random chemical reactions and perhaps with a little bit of self-organization along with that. Once you have the first living cells, then the genome of these cells mutates randomly, and then you have this natural selection process which selects the best adapted individuals, and the others die, and so the better ones will outnumber the less adapted ones, and so on. Life will proliferate, become more and more complex, and all this is only possible because organisms are interacting with their environment. This entails perception, and perception is something like a reaction to physical stimuli. And in case you have a brain and a very highly developed mammal or whatever, this also includes your brain chemistry to react in an appropriate manner to the stimuli that the environment confronts you with. And if you have a brain, maybe even also in earlier stages of biological development, there's also something like a consciousness that's associated with organisms. And this is something like a byproduct of brain chemistry that always is going on in your skull. And regarding psi, well, that's what we are concerned with in parapsychology. That's, of course, not allowed to be, because psi is impossible within a physicalist framework of understanding of life. And, of course, this is also the reason why parapsychologists are usually met with great hostility or skepticism from within the mainstream community of scientists and also mainstream biologists. But due to my understanding of the literature and a few personal experiences, I think that's quite a wrong assumption. Psi is possible. So if that assumption is wrong, and I think we can also extrapolate that a bit and say all the rest is also wrong, but it's not only because of psi is possible, but there are also other reasons that, in my opinion, point to the fact that the physicalist definition or understanding of life is incorrect. And I'm going to talk a little bit about this in the next slides, for example, here. Regarding the origin of life, I mentioned earlier that yeah, physicalists or chemists say that these are only random chemical reactions, and I don't think that's the case. We have to have long-chain molecules such as the DNA, the RNA, proteins, but also quite coherent, nice lipid layers that may form first cell membranes and all these things. And in my book, I mentioned earlier, I had a deeper look at all these issues, and I identified 24 unsolved problems regarding prebiotic chemistry that need to be overcome in theory and in practice before we can say with a reasonable confidence we know how life originated. In fact, even at the time being, biologists and chemists have no idea at all how life came into existence, even though you read some new scientific articles here and every now and then who may suggest the contrary, but it's not the case if you have a deeper look. All we have is quite unsecure speculations that also sometimes contradict each other. Anyway, still life appeared on Earth at one point, and then increasing complexity of organisms took off and took place. And for example, with regard to the morphological development of organisms, the neo-Darwinian perspective says, well, we only need these random mutations in the genome and we need enough time, and then everything will explain itself. And also, I think that's quite problematic and not really backed up by the data that we have. There was an entire research branch called mutation research. You can see that here. And this was performed in the second half of the 20th century, after the structure of the DNA was understood and unraveled. People subjected literally millions of organisms, bacteria, little flies, worms, plants, but also vertebrates, to chemicals that would induce mutations in the genome, but also to X-rays, which are also known to cause mutations in the genome. And they cultivated, even especially the little organisms, for thousands of generations, and wanted to create new species and wanted to play or reenact evolution and all these things and produce useful organisms for medicine or for agriculture. But after all these years, they suddenly or not suddenly, I think it was kind of gradual realization, it didn't work. All the mutations, or most of all the mutations, they were pathological. Never once there was an increase in complexity. All they had to deal with was lots of traits. And yeah, if there were a few mutations that could have been regarded as positive, this almost, or maybe even exclusively, concerned the modification of an already existing metabolism pathway. But that's it. Nothing big happened, nothing big changed. And so this branch of research, which was originally fed with enormous financial resources and manpower, was quietly abandoned, and one just returned to crossing organisms, choosing parents, crossing, or producing transgenetic organisms. So mutation research really showed that random mutations are no good as a means for evolution, even though it's still the main thing you read in biological textbooks. So, and then what about the significance of natural selection? That's also an interesting issue to look at. For example, if you look at animals like these, the cheetah, the mole, maybe even a fish, yeah, it's clear. These animals are really well adapted to their environment, and the many traits, both morphological and also behavioral, fit neatly into their ecological niche. So these are the types of animals you find in textbooks or in biology about selection, adaptation, evolution, and so on. But what about other organisms? For example, plants. This is an example of different leaf shapes of trees and of herbs. And I'd say the plants, it really actually doesn't matter how exactly these leaves are shaped. The plant still grows, and sometimes even under identical environmental circumstances, like here on a meadow. And the same goes actually also for the flowers and the blossoms. They are extremely diverse, and still many of them are pollinated by exactly the same insects. So the pressure of the environment and the adaptation to this environmental pressure seems to be quite loose in these cases. And the shapes and colors and forms are not necessarily necessary, I would say. And also the same applies to coral reefs. Lots of amazing shapes and colors and animals live there. Like these ones, for example, they don't even have eyes, so not even sexual selection come into play. Still, they are amazingly colored, and yeah, I don't know in which way natural selection or random mutation can explain these extraordinary appearances of animals in these cases. So in my opinion, there's a general functionality that needs, of course, to be taking place in organisms, but the exact details seem to be dependent on quite autonomous development dynamics. And now I'm a friend of fungi, so I also devote a slide to fungi. This even goes much more for fungi. Look at the amazing wealth of fungi fruiting bodies. This is only a very narrow example. There are many, many more shapes and colors and everything. You name it, mushrooms do it. And it's very obvious, in my opinion, that numerous of these traits have no positively selectable adaptive value. And this is also the reason why fungi, for example, are never mentioned in biological textbooks on selection, adaptation, and evolution, because you simply cannot explain why these fruiting bodies are shaped and colored as they are. So what biologists do, they just leave everything that's problematic aside and focus on that's what's easy to explain. For example, in this book on speciation, which is a very academic and very cool textbook on these matters, you find lots and lots of animals covered. There's quite a few and reasonable amount of plants, specifically with regard to geographic variations and so on. But you don't find a single fungi species mentioned in this academic textbook on speciation, and I don't like that, and the fungi also don't like that, and don't mess with fungi. They are very important parts of our ecosystems, and I recommend not to disregard them. All right, but we still can go on with regard to increasing complexity of organisms. There are many behavioral developments that are also difficult to explain by mutation and natural selection, such as instincts, especially in the insect, the world of insects. You find very intricate and very complex and very baffling instincts. I don't go into detail here. Intellect by itself is something peculiar. Consciousness, even in people like savants abilities. Can Peak, who remembered everything he ever read or heard, and things like these. But the brain itself is a very peculiar organ. I performed a survey on unusual brain-related findings, published some years ago, and this is only one example. Sometimes people have a severe disease in their brain hemispheres, and the only remedy is to take the whole hemisphere out. Just like in this case of this woman. And the funny thing is that these people retain all their memories, the personality doesn't change, and even if they have bodily disabilities resulting from that, like being having hemiplegia on one side of the body, the movements are not really functioning well. This can, in time, even be reversed. So it can be that you don't even notice that these people only have half a brain. And also from a evolutionary perspective, this is quite amazing, because the brain uses, I think, 20% of our oxygen and energy. And so if we can live with half of the brain size, we can save very much energy and oxygen. And in terms of natural selection, we should have been selected to have a brain of half the size than we actually do have. Anyway, another very fascinating topic is the psychophysiological influence on our, for example, own body, which can be elicited via hypnosis, or in people suffering from dissociative identity disorders, women who produce symptoms of false pregnancy. There's one case in the literature where the physicians even heard the heart of the fetus bumping, but there was no fetus in there. And this goes all up the way to the sudden whitening of hair. I brought a few pictures on that. But first here, this is an example referring to hypnosis. This woman was given the suggestion in hypnosis to develop the stigmata of Jesus on the cross, like the wounds of the thorn crown and the nails in the feet. And she was also suggested to cry blood from her eyes. And this physician, Dr. Lechler, he and his team observed all this happening. So how the skin turned red, how it swelled, how the skin cracked and the blood flew out. So very amazing if you want to explain this, for example, in physical, chemical terms, for example. Even more, sudden whitening of hair. Why is that even more surprising? Well, hair is dead matter. There's no metabolism, there's no physiology. So actually it's not supposed to change color anymore, no matter what happens. But still there are many, many reports of people who turned white within one night or even a few hours in extreme cases, 3 nights, whatever. And because this is not understandable in physiological terms, these anecdotes are typically also dismissed as impossible by physicians and medical personnel. Nevertheless, I performed a review study of the medical literature, only the medical literature of the last 200 years, and I found more than 200 cases reported by physicians. More than 40 were reported by first-hand observations in which the physicians really observed how the hair color changed within a few days or a few hours even. So one case, this is a very drastic case published by the director of the Frankfurt University Clinic, Ferdinand Hoff. This person's hair, but also the eyebrows, eyelids, pubic hair, any hair on his body turned white within a few days, and the rest followed within a few weeks in the hospital. And I also found 2 animals. This horse has become a white mane after a very severe emotional trauma. So animals are also quite human. So this happens apparently in reality, even though it's not explicable in physiological terms at present. So the question is, are we already dealing with psychokinesis in these cases? And I think this is one of these interesting intersections between the border areas of biology or medicine and what we study in parapsychology. It's not a separate realms of research discipline, but it's all interrelated. Well, regarding psi, I think it's a continuum of psychokinesis and forms of extrasensory perception, such as pre- and retrocognition, clairvoyance, and telepathy. And some parapsychologists think, yeah, ESP is okay, but I don't believe in psychokinesis. But I think, well, why? Actually, sometimes it's really not very easy to discern what actually happened. Sometimes we don't know if it was clairvoyance or telepathy what was going on, even in experimental settings. And even if we clearly know it was telepathy, this would, of course, always entail that a change in the brain physiology of the partners would be taking place. And this is actually already tantamount of saying that there was a psychokinetic component to telepathy. So in fact, if you regard it from this perspective, any telepathic event entails a part of psychokinesis. Yeah, the important thing about psi, I also like to stress here, it's always mind-related, of course, and it can be intensified by feelings and emotional bonds. So, well, that's not something that sounds like it can be explained in physicalist terms. What are the consequences of psi? Well, it's not subjected to the space-time as we know it. Psi is not subjected to the mode of efficient causation as we know it. Psi is associated with psychic, consciousness-related issues, and it's not explicable in physicalist terms. And if one aspect of life is not explicable in physicalist terms, I think it's safe to say that this must be extrapolated to life as a whole. So all this points to the existence of a usually hidden background reality with psychic qualities that rests behind our familiar space-time. And of course, many people have had similar thoughts already. And one nature philosophical approach that people discussed, advanced, and worked out in detail is vitalism. Renaud had already talked about it earlier in his talk. And I like to give the definition of vitalism as it was advanced by Hans Driesch, a German biologist, philosopher, and also parapsychologist. And he basically was something like the founder of a neo-vitalist movement in the first half of the 20th century in Germany. And he said, well, life is not reducible to laws governing inorganic matter, such as in physics or chemistry. Rather, life possesses a certain autonomy or autonomous dynamics. And whereas in classic vitalism of the former centuries, people usually assumed kind of a life force that acted inside the body. Often they related it to electricity and things like this. Neo-vitalist approaches assume additional modes of causation, like wholeness causation, theology, finality causation, all these things, or in general, organizing principles that root behind our familiar space-time. And I'd like to add a short note about the appropriate isms associated with that. I think it's important, if we talk about isms, to really specify the level of organization of reality we are talking about. So if we are talking about the biological level and organisms, I think any proper vitalism must be conceived as a dualism. There's the body, there's the brain, and there's the mind, and that maybe can even be separated in out-of-body experience, cases of the reincarnation type, you name it. But if you talk about all existence, you still can adopt a monistic approach, perhaps with an idealism slant, and conceive things as rooting or assuming a common root of mind and matter that is in this, founded in this background reality, and isms related to this is holism, panpsychism, pan-experientialism, animism, all these things. So my point is, dualism and monism don't exclude each other. It's merely a question of level of organization that we are discussing about, and that should always be specified. So, returning to the question, what is life? Well, we have that unfathomable background reality, but then we have our familiar four-dimensional space-time continuum, but that's only the tip of the iceberg. It's not reality. And on these planets and things that circle around within this space-time, or that we can perceive, life, of course, develops, such as on our Earth. And this is the focus of mainstream biology. So they are only concerned with the tip of this iceberg. And of course, this view is, in my opinion, too narrow. It lacks an encompassing understanding of the entirety of life and entirety of organisms and their roots. So life can be described or conceived as a primary phenomenon rising from a psyche-related background reality, which continues to permeate all organisms rooted in there. Now I turn to my historical perspective. It's always good to see that you're not alone thinking about these things, but others did so already. And one of the most important figures in that context is Arthur Schopenhauer. And I'm now only introducing people who explicitly related parapsychological phenomena to life and evolution. And he was one of the first. And to make a long story short, in his philosophy, all organisms, everything that exists is nothing but an objectivation of a will that is unperceivable for us. He likens it to the thing in itself, developed by Immanuel Kant. And with regard to evolution, Arthur Schopenhauer said, well, that's conceivable, yes, evolution is okay, but it cannot be conceived without taking the will in the background into account, because the will drives the development of organisms and even evolution. Eduard von Hartmann followed Schopenhauer in many ways in his thinking, but also Schelling and Hegel, and his main work in this respect was the philosophy of the unconscious, which took Schopenhauer's thoughts further. The same goes for Hans Driesch. I mentioned him already. He was also a big fan of Schopenhauer and was very adamant in promoting the importance of parapsychology for understanding biology. And then there were two very seriously looking gentlemen down there, Carl Gustav Jung and Wolfgang Pauli, psychologists and physicists, who had some very clever things to say about all these issues. But there are many, many more people in the German-speaking context, but I'd just like to highlight those. But also turning to other countries, there's in Italy, we have Ernesto Bolzano, who was very knowledgeable with regard to parapsychological matters, a prolific writer, an interesting man in many regards. And I'd like to credit him. I like his work a lot with this citation, because I think it's not too much known that Bolzano was also concerned with these matters. So in 1905, he wrote something like this: to the biological evolution of species, there corresponds a parallel psychical evolution, which dominates the former, and which, independent of the law of natural selection, we shall recognize as deriving its origin from an active immaterial principle. So that's a very general expression of the matters that many other authors advanced. In France, we have, for example, Gustave Gély. He published this book in 1919, what was then also translated into English, From the Unconscious to the Conscious. And Gély heavily relied on Schopenhauer and also on von Hartmann in developing his philosophy. Turning to the English-speaking world, well, many people thought in similar terms as well. Most importantly, also Alfred Russel Wallace, who was a co-founder of the theory of evolution along with Charles Darwin. And Wallace recognized in later years that his theory of evolution was insufficient, and he proposed that evolution can only be understood if we take into account a hidden mental layer of existence that drives organism development and also evolution. We have also Frederick Myers in this list, Sir Oliver Lodge, William McDougall, Sir Alistair Hardy, Arthur Koestler, to name but a few. I'd like to mention John Randall because he's not so well known, but he wrote a very interesting book in 1975, Parapsychology and the Nature of Life, summarizing all this stuff very nicely, and a really recommendable book. Rupert Sheldrake, of course, many of you will know his work on morphic fields, morphogenetic fields, morphic resonance. That's also in many ways related to these thoughts. And then another person I would explicitly like to mention here is Ian Stevenson and his work on cases of the reincarnation type, which are usually discussed with regard to the question, well, do they provide evidence or proof for the personal survival of death, for reincarnation, or can they also be explained in living agent psi or super psi terms? It's an interesting discussion by itself, but for the present context, it's entirely irrelevant, because regardless how we explain it, fact is, and I think these are facts, that memories, also behaviors, birthmarks, birth defects, can reappear in a person that is born after another person or previous personality has died. So the important aspect of this, even Stevenson mentioned it only very carefully in some hidden parts of his work, unfortunately, because I think it's really revolutionary. His research provides empirical evidence that there's a third factor at work, in addition to genetics, in addition to environmental influence shaping the development of an organism. There's this psychic inheritance of acquired characteristics. And once you really take that seriously, that has the potential to really blow current evolution theories apart and develop the next stages of it. And Stevenson, with regard to Hans Driesch, stated something like this also in this book, his monograph, Reincarnation and Biology, and you have to read a lot. He, on page 2068, he says something that I printed here. I cannot object if what I propose is called vitalism. Although the word has become a term of abuse with some biologists, I think a new generation of them will one day accept it as an important truth. Well said. Here's one, and I hope we can, or the parapsychological community, maybe even biologists, will pick up this impetus and really recognize what Stevenson has done and drive and take the message further. All right, so summing up, I've showed you that there's much agreement with regard to how we should interpret life and perhaps even evolution. All people who were concerned with parapsychology and its significance for understanding nature and life basically shared the same conclusions, and it's always a good sign. It seems some logic is entailed in there. Now the question is how we can go on from there. Can we add some new evidence? Can we make some progress with regard to this hypothesis? And in this context, in my book, I proposed two hypotheses that could, in fact, also be tested with regard to the development of new species in the course of evolution. First, I said, well, if we assume that there is a kind of a hidden background reality in which organisms are rooted, then changes in the genome that affect evolutionary development should differ from random mutations as generated, for example, by exposing organisms to X-rays. If you like, that's the hypothesis of non-randomness of change, or of evolutionary change. Second, assuming this background reality, then we may also assume that the modification of species can originate in the genome of several individuals, and they don't even have to be related, at about the same time. So that's the hypothesis of distributed origin of evolutionary change. And it contrasts to the standard model in the new Darwinian perspective, where they would say, well, there's one individual and it has a mutation, and it finds an appropriate partner, and they produce offspring together, and this offspring again has this mutational driven change, and then those offspring again produce offspring. It will outnumber all the colleagues of the species because they will die out because they are inferior to the superior individuals bearing this mutation. So it's originating from actually a single individual. And this does not necessarily have to be the case if the will or the background reality, the species concept rooted in there itself changes and will automatically give rise to changes in several individuals at the same time. Well, let's have a look. With regard to the first hypothesis, I explained already that mutation research actually showed, well, it's not a very fruitful path of research. Much pathology was the result, but not evolutionary progress. Then we have, in very recent studies, indication that genomes of organisms can factually be adapted to environmental pressure, which is quite peculiar and should not be the case in case we only deal with random mutations. And this is mainly also due to recent developments in epigenetics. I make a long story short, but this concerns heritable processes that don't rely on the genome and are non-DNA based inheritance involvement. Yeah. And then there are also very, very rapid adaptive evolution processes that have recently been observed in different animals, cave animals, certain groups of fish, birds, beak and wing shapes. Within a few generations, they changed their shapes in entire populations. Also lizards, there was a very amazing study on lizards that were introduced to an island, and within 30 generations, they changed completely their behavior, their morphological appearance, their digestive tract and everything. And it's even the young had it already. They were born with these changes, so it had already become habitable. And we could even test this further. For example, if you have those mutated flies that they bear a mutation that results in flies without wings, and we could compare this to the genome of flies who had lost their wings due to evolutionary processes and live without wings in the wild. So we could have a look at the genomes and have a look if really the same sequences or areas in their genomes are affected or not. There was one possibility to also follow that. Now I turn briefly to my second hypothesis, which is that of the distributed origin of evolutionary change. And I'd like to discuss that regarding an example from human evolution or microevolution. It is increasingly recognized that humans still evolve, even today, we evolve. And this refers to, for example, a certain artery the median artery, a third artery in our forearms. Usually we only have these two, but the bright one in the middle, some people have it. Then there's the fabella, this little bone here in our knee, or not in ours, in human knees. It was quite rare a few years ago. 100 years later, it has drastically increased. Wisdom teeth decrease. More and more people are born without wisdom teeth. More and more people are born with shorter jaws, and so on. And I would like to focus on this first example in my next slides and have a closer look on this microevolutionary trends. It was just published 2020 by a team led by Tegan Lucas. And they found that towards the end of the 19th century, only 10% of the population had this third artery. Now, more than 100 years later, 35% of the population have this third artery already. And they say, well, if this continues, then everybody that is born in 80 years, in 2100, will have this third artery. Okay, that's something. And there are even two types. One type extends all the way up to the hand, and the other type of this median artery somewhere ends in the forearm. Now, what are possible explanatory models for that? Lucas suggests, well, first of all, that can be due to an environmental influence. If a fetus grows in a pregnant woman, every arm has 3 arteries, but in the progress of growing, this third artery is being regressed. It's deconstructed. So when the baby is born, there are only 2 arteries left. So now if we assume that there was a health insult, maybe a bad infect of the mother or of the fetus, this process that degenerates and regresses this artery is stopped, so that artery is retained because of this defect in this evolution or in this developmental process. So that's explanation 1, health insult, stopping the regression of this artery. Second is mutations. Some people have a mutation that causes this regression to stop or not to commence or whatever. Now let's have a look at this explanatory models. The authors say, well, some arguments speak for the health insult hypothesis, for example, infection, because the presence of this artery usually causes problems with the way the wrist and this tendon inflammation stuff. So that's usually or should be regarded as a disadvantage. There's no selection value. And I've mentioned it earlier, there are 2 types of this artery. One goes to here, one also only to here. So that would entail 2 different types of mutations. And they say, well, because both types increased, both mutations must somehow increase. And from a statistical perspective, all this is extremely unlikely. So things actually speak against the mutation theory and pro the health insult theory. But few sentences later, the argument quite in the opposite direction. Lucas then says, well, healthcare has greatly improved over the last 150 years. So people suffer no health insults anymore, or not in this frequency. Women don't suffer very many infections, and pregnant women or fetuses when they are pregnant. So actually the health insults decrease drastically, and also the prevalence of the median artery should decrease drastically. And they say, well, there's natural selection pressure that promotes mutated individuals bearing this third artery. But wait a minute, didn't they just say that there's no selection value to this artery? So it's actually contradicting. And so they say, well, maybe it's both, maybe it's this, maybe it's that, and maybe it's both. And this is very strange, in my opinion. And if you take a closer look and say, well, they also said in 80 years, let's say this is 4 generations, everybody will have this third artery in his arm or her arm. That would, if you apply the health insult theory, would mean that everybody will have or every woman that gives birth to a child will have had a serious health insult, or the fetus, every. Or if you say, well, it's mutations, that would mean that within 4 generations, all people and all families that don't have this third artery must have died out and must have been outnumbered by families and family offspring that had this artery, because it's such a great selective advantage. But to be honest, it's plain nonsense. It's entirely at odds with population genetics and everything. So all we can say, it's absolutely unknown. There is at present no mainstream explanation that could account for the change in prevalence of this median artery. And it's also a very good example, in my opinion, demonstrating that critical thinking stops too early. So if the 2 only possibilities that physicalist approaches allow make no sense, they still stick to it instead of opening their minds and looking for other alternatives, such as the ones I just suggested. So with regard to this hypothesis of the distributed origin, I say, well, these trends in microevolution, they seem to support it. And because more and more studies are performed in this area of microevolution, and also with a specific focus on humans, I think we have very interesting times ahead in this respect. And so far, from my perspective, all this supports the notion that these are autonomous development dynamics, and they are objectivations of something going on from beyond, the expression of something. We don't even need to understand what exactly, but yeah. In any case, it's important to know that mutations and natural selection are of minor importance in these areas of research and theorizing. Okay, big look on the watch. Now I come to the conclusion of my talk. There is the so-called evolutionary synthesis, and this is the neo-Darwinian model of evolution, the physicalist approach I've been introducing to you earlier. Another interesting development in the biological setting is that more and more people come to realize that this is insufficient. And they now developed what is called the extended evolutionary synthesis. And it's extended insofar that they say, we need to take epigenetics into account, non-genetic inheritance, and we also have to recognize that organisms play an active role in evolution processes. They are active drivers of evolution. They create their own ecological niches. They create their own future, if you like, and so on and so on. And it's some very sophisticated proposals have been published in this regard. And also the common agreement with regard to those authors who propose this extended evolutionary synthesis is that random mutations and natural selections are not enough. Of course, they all occur in nature, but they're all only of minor importance. As I said, this is just a very recent trend. Leading authors are Kevin Leland, Eva Jablonka. If you want to read some of that stuff, it's interesting. And it definitely goes into the right and correct direction. But I think it's also obvious that we need an even more extended evolutionary synthesis that also includes psi, which is not included in this normal extended evolutionary synthesis. So I think there's no way around the fact that we need to rely on a vitalist theory of life and evolution, which again says that life is not reducible to laws governing inorganic matter. Life possesses or represents autonomous dynamics, and we have to take additional modes of causation and organizing principles into account that root behind our familiar space-time. So what has that to do with us? What does that mean for us as humans? Well, I think if you think it through, it leads to a re-enchantment of nature, similar to what was going on Pandora, planet Pandora, in the Avatar movie. And it shows us to respect our roots and our larger self, if you like, and to care for all life and our planet, because we have a common root in that background reality and are interlaced and internetted in these ecological systems. And this neatly matches to what Jack has just explained about deep ecology as it advanced by Arne Naess and Joanna Macy and these people. And this is why I also think that psi is the missing link. It is not appropriately recognized in standard mainstream science. Still, psi is the link that links biological, physical, psychological, philosophical, social, and also spiritual dimensions of existence. And this is why also, in my opinion, parapsychology is the most fascinating and important science discipline one can be engaged in. Okay, so thank you very much.